Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, James Holland, and with John McManus. And John, I had an interesting week last week because I was galling around the battlefields of Sicily. And one of the guys who has been on an earlier tour that I've done and was there last week was called Kevin Milan. And Kevin is an American, and his dad was in the 82nd Airborne. And actually, we read his father's story out on Family Stories a little while ago. But anyway, we were going from A to B from one of the places we were looking at in Sicily, and he said to me, why don't you talk about, have a discussion on the influence of the Civil War, and particularly Ulysses Grant, on those West Pointers who kind of went through and ended up being senior generals in the Second World War. And I said, that's a really good idea. Let me put that to John right now. So I then WhatsApped you. You came back, said, yeah, all over that like a rash. And I went back to Kevin and said, yeah, John's up for that. So here we are. So, I mean, what a great subject, and not one that I've given a huge amount of thought to, I have to say. But I mean, I know that sort of Patton, for example, was absolutely obsessed with the Civil War, not least because he had a grandfather who fought in it. But the long tentacles of the American Civil War, and I guess particularly the kind of the changes that General Grant brought in, later President Grant brought in, run very deep, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they're still doing staff rides for the Civil War now. So imagine back then, if you're an officer who's kind of coming of age in the early 20th century, when the Civil War is really the formative event on so many levels. I mean, this would have absolutely shaped your military training. And the most influential Civil War generals, I'd say, or, certainly Grant, but also Lee and Jackson, I think, on many levels. For those who were really studying like deep dive infantry tactics, Emory Upton is a guy who I think has a profound influence at the time, and those who studied him later, I think, much profited from it. But when I heard about that idea that Kevin had, I just thought, man, that is awesome. That's sort of in the wheelhouse because I've been struck by it. That I did several years ago, I gave a special talk at Kansas City Public Library and then at the Eisenhower Library about the parallels, almost eerie parallels between Grant and Eisenhower. And I mean, it's just so similar. Their backgrounds are sort of similar. Eisenhower was born to humbler circumstances, I guess, but still, they're kind of middle American, very unassuming. Both were infantry officers. Neither really liked their time at West Point. On many levels, got a lot of demerits, and you never necessarily mark them as people for high command. They were both people who did better in war than in peace, on some levels. They both eventually are going to take a lot of criticism for their personal life. Grant for his drinking, Eisenhower for playing golf and bridge and poker and so on and so forth. Of course, both became presidents, and both were very unlikely. Both had, I think, a very kind of American attritional outlook to war. In war fighting, I think that's one of the secrets to their success.
Well, it's a numbers game.
In some respects, but also understanding maneuver and understanding firepower and understanding how economies work together with military power. They both had tremendous regard for their soldiers and had that kind of rapport and affability, I think, on many levels. They were both really down-to-earth people. Which also is a very American kind of characteristic in terms of our most successful commanders, Patton and MacArthur notwithstanding. I think that the best ones tend to have that kind of rapport with the average soldier because of the idea that these are citizen soldiers. This is supposedly, a country where the individual matters a lot. And so they need to have that.
And you can certainly apply that, can't you, to Eichelberger, to Bradley, to Simpson.
Absolutely.
To Ridgway. I mean, they're all cut from that cloth. I mean, I guess that sort of main crop of the kind of Eisenhower, Bradleys, all that lot, they're at West Point, what, sort of 1910 10, 11, 12, so just on the eve of the First World War, aren't they? So they're kind of, it's 45, 50 years after the end of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, they're basically the inheritors of the Civil War. They're absolutely marked by it. I mean, so I'll give you some examples. So here's some examples. MacArthur himself is a product of the Civil War. His father, Arthur, was on the Union side and earned the Medal of Honor for his valor at the Battle of Missionary Ridge. It basically launches his military career. And then he meets this Southern woman from Virginia who's very much a kind of an unreconstructed Confederate and everything that kind of means. Okay, and so here's this unlikely union of these two people. And it's so controversial that her brothers would not attend the ceremony when she married this Yankee. And so MacArthur is the product of this union. And yet in his case, he really looks to like Lee and Jackson and that whole lost cause, these were the greatest commanders ever kind of mentality. Eisenhower, by contrast, I think looks to Grant a little bit more. Now, to be sure, he studied Lee and Jackson and many other commanders on the Confederate side too. But I think personally, Grant had the most influence on Eisenhower when you look at how he actually operated. Eichelberger is another example who is a guy was a product of the Civil War. His father's a Union veteran. His mother grew up in Port Gibson, Mississippi, and remembered the battle there and wounded soldiers being in their parlor or whatever, and helping take care of them. So here's another kind of North-South union. So Eichelberger was steeped in that from the earliest boyhood.
But isn't that amazing that you can have Second World War generals whose parents have fought in the Civil War?
Yeah, well, and the most famous one, I think, is Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., whose father was a general on the Confederate side. And of course, in that instance...
who's later killed on Okinawa.
Yeah, and so Buck's dad, was over age. He was in his 60s when Buckner Jr. was born, because this was a second marriage and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so here's a guy who's, again, completely steeped directly in what his father had done during the Civil War and everything that meant. And it's one of the things that influences him to go into a military career. And I think that's true of many others. So another great example is Edward Ned King. And in case people haven't heard of him, he's the guy who has to surrender the forces on Bataan. So Ned King was a Southerner. So here's another white Southerner. You'd figure he's a kind of old South, lost cause guy, big segregation guy, and you couldn't be more wrong if you figure that. And this is what I think is interesting about him. He's in command at a 2-star level in the Philippines, and he's telling his officers who come to join his army, racial distinctions are nonsense. People are the same, and you need to treat Filipinos like equals. And he's an opponent of segregation back home. And yet, he also has had this entire formative boyhood and early training around the Confederate battles and all that. He knows them intimately. The irony of ironies, he has to surrender at Bataan, April 10th, 11th, 1942. It's the exact anniversary of when General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. And so when King is going to meet General Hama, the Japanese commander, he's got in his mind Lee's famous statement that he makes when he knows he's checkmated at Appomattox. So now I will go to see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths. So he's thinking in his mind, that's exactly what's going through his mind, 1,000 times as he's going to meet the Japanese commander under very different circumstances, of course. But the Civil War is right there front and center, I guess is my point. And I think that's true of a lot of people.
And there's not a single person who's gone through West Point at that stage who doesn't know the intimate details of the Civil War. They know all the battles, they know all the key players, they know the tactics, they understand the kind of logistical issues, all that kind of stuff. That is just absolutely part and parcel of being a West Point undergraduate cadet.
It is. I mean, they've studied them minutely, and they've walked a lot of the ground. And they've even trained on some of the ground, too.
Right, so a lot of staff rides going to Gettysburg and Chancellorsville and all the rest of it.
Absolutely, and maybe served there. Like, for instance, Eisenhower, famously during World War I, never deploys overseas. Where is he? He's in the Gettysburg area, basically training troops very successfully. And it creates in him a kind of a love for that area, which eventually, once he retires, he builds his retirement home there and lives there just off the edge of the battlefield. So, these places that were, hallowed battlegrounds also became training grounds. Chickamauga is another example during the Spanish-American War. And that's a little before the time a lot of these guys, although not, Douglas MacArthur is just going to West Point around that time. So, this wasn't that long after the Civil War. And the memory was very firm. And it's also, it's caught up in a lot of other aspects of American history at that point, this sort of rapprochement between North and South, which also has come at the expense, though, to some extent, of African Americans in the South. And their treatment as equal citizens is just out the window as a result of this on some level. So most of the officers are not really thinking of the Civil War socially in that context. They're thinking of it tactically, of what they're learning from the battle. And there's a lot to learn there.
Okay, so I'm thinking of 2 points really. And the first one is that, when one thinks of a civil war, you're thinking of rows and rows of people lined up, marching towards each other and being sort of cut to shreds, whoever attacks, by Gatling guns and superior artillery. And the whole kind of muskets and so on are kind of all a bit of a waste of time, really. And you think of, wholesale slaughter, and this is sort of the end of the road for the kind of lining up, marching towards the enemy kind of approach to battle, which has been, as old as the hills. So the question is, how relevant is that to kind of the evolution of the battlefield between the 1860s and the 1940s? But the second point, of course, is that tactics might change, weaponry might change, but certain principles hold true about supply and logistics and command and high ground and all that kind of stuff. So what, I suppose, are those similarities valid, and what are the differences?
I mean, the similarities are absolutely valid. So, these guys have studied, obviously, the Civil War, but also World War I, quite famously. Some of them had been in it, but even those who hadn't, General Marshall, later General Marshall, has created this whole book of sort of incidents from World War I. And so they're kind of learning from both wars, I would argue, at the tactical level. And so what are they learning from it? I mean, actually, the pattern in the Civil War is really similar to World War I in that, yes, of course, it's different in the way they fight, but armies in the open fighting, 1914 in a way, this kind of maneuver as both are trying to come to grips eventually on the Marne and all that business too, that leads eventually towards trench warfare to armies going to ground. You see the same kind of pattern in the Civil War. Of course, there's plenty of maneuver warfare, but you see trench warfare. And especially by 64 and 65, most notably at Petersburg. So how you deal with fortifications, how you deal with firepower, how you maneuver your forces, logistics, like you said, Jim. I mean, all of this, it doesn't change that much on some levels.
So the whole kind of sort of being lined up and marching towards your imminent demise, that's very much in the kind of early part of the Civil War rather than the second half of the Civil War.
It tends to be. Now, we could probably find plenty of tactical battles where, some units are still fighting a little bit out in the open like that even later. But for the most part, the pattern is more open fighting, especially like the first Battle of Bull Run. Some of the tactical fights are in the Peninsula Campaign, so on and so forth. But even Gettysburg is a big kind of open maneuver battle, but it's also sprinkled with fortifications too. And it's one of the reasons why Pickett's Charge is such a disaster. It's a frontal attack against a pretty heavily fortified position with artillery support. And so in that sense, we could say, well, the Hurtgen Forest is really not all that different on some levels than Pickett's Charge. So there are, some level of similarities there, but the pattern has been in the Civil War that armies are going to start to go to ground. I mentioned earlier Port Gibson, which is sort of an adjunct on some levels of the Vicksburg campaign, which, of course, famously becomes a kind of siege battle in which the armies are dug in opposite each other. And Grant tries several times to kind of breach those Confederate defenses with attacks. And then he realizes, I'm going to have to back off and just kind of pound these guys and starve them. And again, logistics. I mean, so there are times when you had to do that. And then there are other times, where eventually the armies have to come to grips on some levels. And you kind of see it play out that way in the Battle of Atlanta, too. Plenty of fortifying, but also in the end, some maneuver battles, too. Well,
and of course, in the Second World War, the story is riddled with tales of people advancing over open ground and being cut to smithereens, whether it be on the Eastern Front or the Western Front. I mean, actually, now I think about it, last week, we were at Jella, and we were actually looking at the counterattack on the 11th of July from the perspective of the Italians, and we were looking at the 34th Infantry Regiment, the 3rd Battalion, which is part of the Livorno Division. And, they attacked from this feature called the Castelluccio, and they've got literally no artillery support whatsoever. It hasn't appeared. They've got a few mortars, and that's it. And they are advancing across open ground in the middle of the day against the Americans and offshore naval guns. And the Americans, who overnight, because Allen has always been keen on night operations, have dug in on the key either side of the key roads. And of course, they get cut to smithereens. And I suppose, where's the difference? I mean,
it's very similar.
Yeah. But I remember, my kind of sort of high school history was, one of the reasons why Grant was so successful was because all the Civil War generals on both sides had all been at West Point together and all kind of learned the same rules. But Grant had been a bit of an iconoclast and kind of kept getting in trouble. So didn't do the orthodox route. And that's why he won, because he was introducing different approaches. Is there any truth in that, or is that just sort of schoolboy nonsense?
There's a kernel of truth. I mean, he was kind of an innovative thinker on some levels, and he was not conventional. And he was not conventional as a person.
Okay, so in what way wasn't he conventional? Because he emerges in the Civil War, doesn't he? He's not at the forefront at the beginning, exactly. and it's kind of by the middle second half of the war that he really starts to kind of emerge.
Yeah, so I think that requires delving a little bit deeper into Grant's background and just getting a sense of who this guy was. You're right; he's an iconoclast at West Point. He's got all these demerits. There's this one thing he does really well at West Point, and that's horsemanship. And that sounds funny today, but in those days, that was a big deal for an officer. It really did, and interesting for an infantry officer too. But he's a guy who, during the Mexican-American War, finds his way as a junior officer, a commander, and understanding how to relate and deal with people. The problems for Grant start to set in during peacetime. When, and of course, the Army in that era, in the late 1840s and the 50s, you could be in some pretty desolate places where you couldn't take your family, and you could be there for years in this out-of-the-way post. And Grant's in that situation. He has a very strong bond with his wife, Julia, and a really kind of dysfunctional, kind of difficult relationship with his in-laws, particularly his father-in-law, who's this Southern guy who is just very confrontational, very much like this guy, Julia, this guy you've married is no good kind of thing.
And so he's on the Confederate side, politically, is he later on?
Politically, the father-in-law is. So the Dent family they owned a few slaves, not a lot, but they owned a few. They actually, they lived in the St. Louis area, where I live. And so Grant lived here for a time and tried to make his way in a business here. And it was just a spectacular failure. He has a situation where he eventually, this is after he's resigned from the Army, and even that doesn't go smoothly. He's trying to get back from the West Coast, and he's basically destitute. And he has to borrow money, ironically, from Simon Bolivar Buckner, of all people, in order to actually get home to St. Louis and try and start this business. He's reduced to selling firewood. You can imagine how uncomfortable this is. So here's a guy who has a great relationship with his wife, and he's a good father to his kids. But with his in-laws, God, there's so much tension, and there's alcohol problems, and so when the war begins, the only reason why Grant is going to have any traction at all is because of his military background. And these guys are so desperately needed on both sides, especially the Union side, because remember, a lot of these guys have frittered off to the South and, have resigned their commissions. And so even more so, we need guys who are professional soldiers who have that background. So Grant gets an opportunity, very low level, almost at the clerk and administrative level, to kind of run a small command in Western Illinois.
And how old is he in, say, 1860?
Let's see, how old is he? He's pushing 40, I think. He's in his late 30s, maybe pushing 40. So he's pretty young.
Okay, still pretty young still.
Yeah, so he's the right age in a sense. I think he's West Point class of 46 or something, whatever that would make him. And he doesn't live long. I mean, he died in 1885, so he was in his 60s. So, yeah, I mean, and he's really frustrated at first because mostly what he's doing is just paper pushing. So he's the classic guy who wants to get in combat, and it's a while before he has that opportunity. But when he does, he's basically at the regiment and brigade command level, and it's very clear that he knows what he's doing, that he's a fighter to anybody who's watching. Now, the problem Grant will have during the Civil War is this sort of frenemy in Henry Halleck. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him, but Henry Halleck was the U.S. commander, like in the Western Theater for a time, and eventually, he had really aspired to what Grant was going to become, like general of the armies kind of thing and control of the battles. Halleck and Grant had known each other a long time, Halleck was sort of his sponsor, but also his sabotager,
Right.
depending on what they were talking about. And so Halleck, eventually, Lincoln's going to see him for what he is, not a fighter, but a really good administrator who acts in the chief of staff role, not the same way George Marshall did, but certainly as a guy who helps run things in Washington. Before that, though, he is sort of overseeing Grant, and then he's chagrined by his success, Grant's success. He's like, oh my gosh, this is a real rival now to my power, and I'd better sidetrack him if I can. So it was, in a way, very MacArthur-esque, like what MacArthur does to Eichelberger after Buna. Like, oh my gosh, this guy could be a threat to my publicity. I better backbench him. In this case, Halleck is even more internecine, in saying, okay, I'm going to spread rumors now that Grant's drinking again, and and that he's botched the Shiloh battle, the Battle of Shiloh, which at that point in April 1862 was the biggest battle that we know of ever fought on this continent, and it was a horrifying preview into what the Civil War is going to be. So Grant has to struggle against that kind of fire in the rear in a way that Eisenhower I don't think ever really does. Eisenhower at least has that sponsor in George Marshall always, where he knows he's got Ike's back. And so Ike's challenge, of course, is dealing with all these egos and in the international thing that Grant doesn't have to worry about in the Civil War. He doesn't have to worry about working with allies the way that Eisenhower does. But I'll say this, Eisenhower directly draws from Grant and his interpersonal skills, his modesty especially, as an asset. And I think that's important to understand why Ike does this.
So Grant is fundamentally, he's a good human being in a way that Eisenhower is a good human being. He has empathy, humanity, all that kind of stuff. He's not just a kind of roughneck rascal.
Oh no, and of course, it doesn't mean he's perfect. Grant definitely does have drinking problems at various points in his life, but he's a guy who could control his drinking under the right circumstances. If he was with his family, then it's completely different. Or if he's engaged in leadership during war and also during the presidency. If he's off on his own, melancholic, aimless, then that's when the bottle comes into play. Eisenhower, of course, doesn't deal with that. But the interesting thing about this, too...
He just smokes.
Oh, yeah, well, they both did. And of course, both to their detriment. There's another parallel. Grant's life is cut short by his affinity for cigars because he dies of throat cancer in the 1880s that almost certainly is caused by heavy cigar smoking. Eisenhower was a 4-pack-a-day cigarette smoker who eventually quit. But I think it's fair to say that probably took some time off his life, even though he lived to 79.
80 a day is a hell of a lot, isn't it?
I just can't imagine how any could survive that personally, but that's just me. But Eisenhower actually read Grant's memoirs, and that's what's famous about Grant on some levels is he wrote these memoirs that are just such a model of clarity and so beautifully written. Eisenhower was inspired by that. He read them in the 1920s with the recommendation of his mentor, Fox Connor, who said, hey, you need to read Grant's memoirs. You're going to learn a lot from that. And then when Eisenhower, after World War II, when he's famous and all that, writes Crusade in Europe, he went back before that and reread Grant's memoirs as an example of how to do this. So these two guys are unique among a lot of the generals in that they needed no ghostwriter. They were both beautiful writers. They were good communicators, and that was a serious asset for both of them. So Grant, or Eisenhower, really looked to Grant consciously, and I think both during World War II, both consciously and unconsciously sought to kind of imitate him. And that wasn't true of all the officers of that generation, many of whom had been steeped on Lee and his greatness in the Old South, and Grant as a butcher and all this kind of Southern arguments about what the war had been. And the example of the latter is MacArthur. Even though MacArthur's formative military influence is his father, who's on the U.S. side in the Civil War, really, I think MacArthur on some levels thought of himself as a Southerner. And really, of course, and his mother was around longer and a greater influence on him. And so one of the things I found out in my research that's just sort of cringeworthy is MacArthur has this incident with Douglas Southall Freeman. And if you've never heard of him, he wrote a book called Lee's Lieutenants, which is fascinating. And he wrote a biography of General Lee. He had a history PhD, but he became a journalist in Richmond. and got the Pulitzer Prize, and was just really, really one of the great historians of his time. And as you can imagine, this is a white Southerner, a Virginian, writing in the 1920s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly we would look back on his work today and say, there's a major blind spot in relation to African Americans and the social context of the war and all that. All that's true, but it's still really amazing work. And so MacArthur had read that, and Freeman, towards the end of World War II, was coming to MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo in the occupation. And he planned to write a kind of parallel book, MacArthur's Lieutenants kind of thing. So I found the correspondence between MacArthur and Freeman Freeman hints in one of the letters, you remind me of Lee and Jackson, the way you've operated. And that was like the ultimate compliment. Like, oh my God, those are my gods, kind of thing. And so MacArthur writes back this really kind of obsequious, unctuous reply and says, oh, those are my masters who I've learned from. And, his typical MacArthur language. And then he's like, and if I might presume to write in, this comparison you've made into your book here, he actually literally writes a part of the book for Freeman, he hopes. It's like,
that's extraordinary, isn't it?
It's just, can you imagine someone writing to you and saying, here's a paragraph I've written that I want you to put into your book? I mean,
no, I can't imagine it at all.
It's just like, what? So you see this sort of unctuous kind of attempt by MacArthur. And then on top of it, when Freeman visits, he sits down with Eichelberger and John McCloy. And John McCloy was like an undersecretary of war in the War Department. He's one of these guys who's profoundly influential on American military and national security policy for a long period of time, but isn't that well known. So he's just an insider. Okay. So he's sitting down to a meal with Eichelberger and Freeman, and Freeman's trying to gather all this information, about MacArthur and his lieutenants. And so Freeman asks Eichelberger, he says, okay, so at what point during the Buna campaign did General MacArthur locate his headquarters right there, on the front lines in Buna? And it's so incredibly awkward because MacArthur was never at the front, but he made it seem like he was through his communiques. And so the average person back home, including someone as knowledgeable as Freeman, actually thought MacArthur was leading on the front lines at Buna. And so Eichelberger's in a tough position now because he doesn't want to throw his commander under the bus, but he also doesn't want to mislead this guy who he respects too, of course. He's read Freeman. And eventually, when Freeman's pressing the point, Eichelberger has to say, well, General MacArthur was never there. And he tries to sugarcoat it by saying, it was so swampy, it was so impassable that it wasn't a place for a theater commander. So he tries to kind of soften the blow. But when Freeman heard that, his enthusiasm for the project completely went away. And the book never happened. Because I think he thought, a lot of the stuff I've been seeing coming out of MacArthur's headquarters, I can't trust it. Maybe there's not the story here that I thought there was. And also, too, I think he had picked up on the fact that, unlike Lee, MacArthur would not have any room in his closet for sharing the historical limelight with others, with Eichelberger, with Kruger, all of his commanders, the way Lee is going to share the limelight with Jackson and so many others who had served under him.
It's amazing, isn't it? And when we think about all those generals, I mean, most of them did go to West Point. There's a few who didn't. Terry de la Meza Allen, who goes and then gets kicked out. And he does stand out for being different, doesn't he? Because he's not a spick and span. He's very much a kind of one of those generals who kind of lives for his men, sees all men as equal, and happy talking to a grunt as he is a fellow general or something. But most of them have been, haven't they? I mean, who else hasn't been to West Point? I can't think, really.
Well, George Marshall. I mean, there's a...
Oh, of course.
Example. I mean, that's and Walter Kruger. Walter Kruger hasn't even been to college, for gosh sakes, and hasn't even graduated high school, believe it or not.
He goes up through the ranks, doesn't he?
Yeah, up through the ranks. And so, there were a pretty decent number, although West Pointers dominated general officer ranks. There were a pretty decent number of others, and obviously starting with George Marshall himself, who was a VMI guy. And I think George Marshall was very conscious of the odds he was working against to become chief of staff.
VMI is what? Virginia Military?
Yeah, Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. And boy, you could not find a sort of heart of the South kind of institution, with this possible exception of the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, than VMI. So Marshall is kind of steeped in that tradition, but I think also very fair-minded in a lot of ways. But yeah, so Allen, I think, is interesting too because, let's face it, he has a Latino background, the way we would think of it now.
His mother was Mexican, wasn't she?
Yes, exactly. And that's very American because, there are a lot of Americans who have that kind of dual heritage, especially in the Southwest or, in Texas where I think he had come from. So Allen, I think, is more unconventional on that level, in part because of that. One of the things I love about Allen, and I don't know that he learned this from the Civil War, but his affinity for night attacks and night combat. I think if the Army would have listened more to him, we would have been far more effective from World War II through Vietnam. And night ops are tough to run. Of course, there's a ton of headaches and problems. We all know that. But I think there would have been a better, I think that it would have been an asset in the long run to focus on this area. Now, Eichelberger does some of it too. And I don't know that he knew about what Allen was doing in the European theater, but there are times when Eichelberger will embrace night ops too, and I think quite profitably. So you do see some who are bucking the trend a little bit, but by and large, most weren't.
Well, let's just hold those thoughts, John, and we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Well, welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, James Holland, and with John McManus. And we're talking the influence of the American Civil War on US commanders in the Second World War. So what is it that they're learning? What is a Second World War era general, when he's at West Point or the Virginia Military Institute or even the Citadel for that matter, in kind of 1910 or 12? What is it that they're learning from study of command in the Civil War? Is it logistics? Is it supplies? Is it, what are those key lessons?
Well, I think the biggest thing they're learning is the deep dive tactical stuff and the on-site decision making. Like let's say we're on a Gettysburg staff ride circa 1910 or something. We're really thinking very carefully about the various decisions Lee makes, the decision to engage, to turn this into a larger battle. His attempt to try and envelop the U.S. Army forces there, to basically do what Hannibal had done at Caney, which is what Western commanders have been chasing for generations. So I think you probably would have learned a lot about that. And of course, the whole Pickett's Charge thing would have obsessed you. So I think they would have been learning much more of the tactics than the logistics, though certainly the logistics would have been there, especially if you were studying the Vicksburg campaign or whatever. So well, I think one thing to remember is, West Point in that era of the early 20th century was still primarily like a civil engineering kind of institution. So the bulk of your classes would have been kind of on the STEM side of the house, but you were seeing, more, military tactical kind of instruction and then eventually military history in MacArthur. I mean, I've been banging up MacArthur, of course, as I often do, but to his credit, he really modernizes West Point as superintendent immediately after World War I, introducing more humanities and social sciences, and thus this would have been more military history. So this is maybe a little bit younger generation of officers who are getting a little bit more of that instruction, who are like the Gavins of the world, who are coming of age in the 20s. And then, the other younger generation of like Abrams and Westmoreland and so on and so forth in the 30s. But yeah, so, and part of it too, like, let's say you were at West Point in the late 19th or early 20th century, whatever, like Eichelberger. It's part of it just the avocation, just the fascination with military history that most professional soldiers seem to have. And I think that would have been, so part of it would have been just study on their own as well.
Yeah, and I guess also it's a big event, isn't it, in American history, in the way that Second World War is now the big event in kind of European Western history. 80 years on, 50 years on, it's absolutely there, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, because actually, America traditionally hasn't fought big wars. And, they're kind of skirmishes and stuff. And, big military operations are anathema to the United States military. I mean, it's just not part and parcel of what America does. And then, of course, you've got the massive retrenchment after the First World War. So suddenly America is in World War II, and it's got to up its game in a very big way, and it's got to think a lot bigger. So it's only inevitable that you would go back to the biggest war that the United States has been involved in.
Absolutely.
Which, of course, is the Civil War. And I think it remains, doesn't it? The war with the greatest number of American casualties, obviously to both sides. But even so, that's suggestive of the huge scale of it. And it really is sort of pan-national, isn't it?
It is. It was the kind of war and conflict that it was hard to sit out. If you were a Northerner, it was possible that maybe you wouldn't have been deeply affected. I guess that's possible. If you were a Southerner, white, black, whatever, there's no way. And so this generation of officers by the 20th century, almost all of them have grown out of that and been formed by it. And so they've had fathers, or in the case of Patton, grandfathers, who have been involved in this thing. They've heard the stories. They've been steeped in all this tradition. And of course, they're military oriented anyway. So, Eichelberger, as a kid, one of his greatest memories was when his father would get together with his fellow Civil War veterans. And Eichelberger, as you can imagine this, like as an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, would just sit there. And he would just sit there just fascinated and steeped in all this. And his father had a library of books. And he devoured these books, many of which, of course, were about the Civil War. This does not make him unique at all. And I would argue, too, somebody like him and many others would have studied Emory Upton, who I mentioned earlier. And so Emory Upton, this is a guy who graduated West Point, I think, in 1861. So that's how young he is during the Civil War. And yet he's a general by the end of the war. And he's really, arguably, the U.S. Army's foremost and most thoughtful tactician, who really, he's thinking about how we maneuver and attack in an era of suffocating firepower, which you have in the Civil War. And of course, nothing compared to what you're going to have, of course, but these lessons about how you apply pressure, how you maneuver, how you do coordination of combined arms, and where you attack at the weak point, all of that is going to be very applicable going forward. Upton, I would argue, is really the foremost thinker on many levels. And so those who were better educating themselves as professional soldiers, and I'm including Kruger into this too, who's self-taught.
And reads his history.
Yeah, I mean, Kruger's a total autodidact. I mean, he hasn't had the formal schooling, but he knows more than a lot of his colleagues who have.
It's so often that's the way, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And just for those sort of and those people who don't really know much about the Civil War except that it happened and that it's all about slavery, it's obviously a lot more nuanced than that. It's a lot, it's about industrial North and a more kind of rural South. It's about ways of life. It's about being pushed around by the North and the South resenting it. There's a whole host of different causes and reasons that it escalates. But in the early years of the Civil War, it seems like it's the Confederacy that militarily, at any rate, is having the running. They're having the kind of battlefield successes and stuff. And the big turning point, isn't it, is Gettysburg in July 1863. Because that's the first really major battle success that the Union have, because they've had a host of defeats, haven't they? And things that
yes and no, because it depends where we're talking about. In the East, famously, of course, the North has had a rough time. Where Lee's army in Northern Virginia has won a lot of tactical victories, and now in the West, it's gone quite differently. And
this is where his reputation comes from, and so.
This is where Grant's reputation comes from, winning the Battle of Shiloh, eventually, just completely outmaneuvering the Confederates on many levels, strangling Vicksburg. The North captures New Orleans pretty early on, and that's an enormous blow to the Confederacy. You have battles like Murfreesboro and Chickamauga, so on and so forth, that are bloody. And inconclusive. But by and large, the North is kind of having its way in the Western theater. It's the Eastern theater, of course, where it's otherwise. And one of the reasons is difference-making commanders like Jackson and Lee.
This is Stonewall Jackson, who's killed at Chancellorsville, just at the point of victory, isn't it? Isn't it? It's one of those moments.
Yeah, so here's what happens with that. Speaking of night operations, so Stonewall Jackson has emerged as a result of his tactical brilliance in the First Battle of Bull Run and otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really one of the key corps commanders. So the first Bull Run had been July 1861. You're going to have the Peninsula Campaign that takes place in the spring of 1862, and eventually it spills into May and June. And then, at that point, Jackson is tying down an entire Union army that's supposed to be moving towards Richmond via land, while this other group is coming up on the James Peninsula, or the York Peninsula, excuse me. So Jackson does really brilliant work there. So you could almost compare him to a Patton in a way, in terms of his aggressiveness and his eccentricities.
And Patton loves him, doesn't he?
Patton loves him, and so do generations of American military people to this day. You know what, though? Jackson's a weird dude on a lot of levels. He was
Massive
an instructor.
beard.
And I think of this as a professor. He was a professor at VMI, and his entire educational approach was forcing his students to just memorize stuff. And I think, oh my God, that'd be the worst kind of teaching you could imagine. So he was really, honestly, kind of hated as a teacher because he was just weird and idiosyncratic and tyrannical, and he was very religious. But he's one of these guys who has always had a great deal of acumen. And when war comes along, that's when you see it. He's a big believer in training. And I think that's another thing that as a World War II officer, you would take from Jackson, saying, you know what, it's really going to suck while we train. You're not going to like me. But once we're in battle, you're going to see the advantage we've got over the enemy. Jackson was really the king of that on a lot of levels. So at Chancellorsville, what happens is that, here's a Confederate army that's outnumbered 2-1 and is basically caught in a vice grip between the Army of the Potomac that has carried out this incredible design to do just this, to capture the Army of the Northern Virginia in this vice. The Union commander is Joe Hooker.
Who gave the name to hookers, didn't he?
He did, exactly. And he would be thought of as one of the great Union commanders today.
Not quite as religious.
No, definitely not. And colorful and a lot of, but he's really sharp, but he loses his nerve.
Huge sideburns. Didn't he have huge sideburns?
No, that's Ambrose Burnside, that's where sideburns comes from. He's a completely different story. Very interesting at his level too. But Hooker has this whole concept of how he's going to outmaneuver Lee and sort of vice grip the Army of Northern Virginia, and he's got it. But he loses his nerve. He doesn't press the attack, and he kind of digs in his army to defend, and that gives Lee and Jackson an opportunity to counterattack. And so what they famously do, Jackson does this sort of flanking maneuver over the course of a long day, and this is, early May 1863, and then he hits the entire western flank of the Army of the Potomac at dusk or near dusk. And so began night attacks. Hard to do in the Civil War, of course, much harder to do than during World War II. So Jackson is trying to kind of ride forward and recon to figure out when and if he can press the attack and whatnot. He's mistaken the enemy by a Confederate guard or skirmisher or whatever, and he's shot. So there's a friendly fire incident, perhaps the most famous in American military history.
Yeah.
He's wounded, so it looks like he's going to survive. They had to remove his left arm. I think it was his left arm. But that's happened all the time in the Civil War. These guys had limbs chopped off and they're back commanding sometime later. It's crazy. So it looked like he was going to survive, but eventually pneumonia set in. So Lee wins arguably his greatest victory at Chancellorsville, and in part because of Jackson. But the greatest casualty is, Jackson. And he can never really replace him after that. And you see it at Gettysburg. That's one of the manifestations.
But am I right in saying that the kind of post-Gettysburg, which is July 1863, the kind of material weight of the North just starts to kind of kick in a bit more heavily, and this is where the sieges come in?
It already has. And here's what because I teach a course on the Civil War and Reconstruction. And one of the things I try to really impress upon my students is that it's different from World War II in the sense that, after our great turning point battles, the Allies the percentages are really with them, and they're probably going to win the war as long as the Normandy invasion succeeds, so on and so forth. But in the Civil War, even after Gettysburg, the Confederacy still could have won. In 1864, it was an election year in the U.S. and the North, and it seems probable that Lincoln would be defeated and a new party would come in and cut a deal with the South and the Confederacy. So there were two ways that the Confederacy could have achieved victory: foreign recognition, or just a change in politics, or the Northern public not caring enough about the Union and saying basically to let the South go. So the difference is capturing Atlanta, and when Sherman does that in September 1864. And that's what really coalesces Northern public opinion to say, okay, let's continue with Lincoln's vision of holding the Union together and completely abolishing slavery and trying to create some sort of multiracial republic.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing.
For those like Eisenhower who were studying this at the larger strategic level, I think they learned much. I think for maybe the average general officer or whatever who's coming out of West Point, they're thinking more tactically. What kind of maneuver did Jackson make at Chancellorsville or that kind of thing? And that's valuable. Don't get me wrong. But I don't think there was enough emphasis in that era on the socio-cultural, strategic, and economic context of the war. And certainly nothing on the racial side, which is really the key to the war.
But the point is, at every single level, when you look at the Civil War, it's got a long shadow over the generals of World War II.
Clearly.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously the British commanders don't have that. They have a different kind of heritage. They have a heritage of colonial wars, of course, of the First World War particularly. And it affects them in different ways, doesn't it? I mean, the heritage of the First World War is the slaughter on the Western Front. And the avowal never to kind of do that again, which is, of course, why they're all backing air power and anything that reduces the number of infantry divisions to a bare minimum. I mean, this is something that also that the Americans buy into. It's just so fascinating, isn't it? How heritage comes back and shapes you and helps your decision making and affects your decision making in future conflicts. I mean, really. Just endlessly fascinating. I mean, I got this sort of feeling that we've sort of vaguely just scraped the very top
exactly.
of the very surface of this. I mean, it is fascinating. It is fascinating. And then all those other conflicts and stuff that so many of the junior Civil War commanders end up fighting on the frontier, don't they? And then later on, at the end of the century, and you think of the Custers and so on. And
for sure. Well, and like Joe Wheeler, who is on the Confederate side in the Civil War, and 30 years later, he's one of the key commanders in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, fighting Joe Wheeler. Yeah. And this then was a kind of rapprochement between North and South. And that's the nice side of the story. The really terrible side of the story is it comes at the expense of racial equality, and it comes at the price of enormous racial apartheid and Jim Crow and all that.
Yeah, which takes beyond the Second World War to resolve.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. And that's why the Second World War, I argue, of course, is more important than the Civil War in the sense because it really comes to grip with the issue of race in America. The Civil Rights Movement is part and parcel to the Civil War. What we think of as the Civil Rights Movement, it wasn't new. I'm not saying it's new then, but it's much more effective. And there's a great deal more momentum as a result of World War II because of socio-cultural changes, economic changes brought by the war. The Civil War, and this is Grant's biggest disappointment as president, is the ultimate failure of Reconstruction. Grant does arguably more for African Americans than any single American commander, politician, person, or whatever. He attempts to do more, perhaps even more than Lincoln. It's just that you have this enormous resistance and blowback, particularly among white Southerners, especially Confederate veterans, many of whom are involved in this little thing called the Ku Klux Klan, that is really resisting Reconstruction, violence, all this kind of stuff. And you have a Northern public, whites primarily, who are saying, you know what? We kept the Union together. That's enough. We don't really want racial equality here in New York or Chicago or wherever. Why are we going to pursue this any further? And so they could kind of pretend that this problem didn't exist, at least for a couple of generations, but it's the 20th century wars that changed that whole dynamic. So, yeah we are scratching the surface because there's so many different layers to this. And the way I'm talking about it now is not the way you and I would have talked about it in 1920, or 1940, sure. Probably. You know what I mean? So, and I think that's partly what's so interesting about it. I'm sure there's probably people who are seeing things we don't.
Well, we should absolutely do a couple of episodes on the effect of World War II on the civil rights movement. I mean, that would be just so absolutely. Interesting.
For sure.
But I think we need to wait for Al to come back for that one because I know he won't want to miss out on that. Well, John, I mean, that's been just really, really interesting. I think sometimes it is important to kind of go back in time and go back in history to kind of contextualize the period that one is looking at. And that's just a sort of case in point. Absolutely fascinating. So thank you. And thank you to everyone for listening. And we will be back next week. Okay, some point we've got to talk about Stilwell.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe next week. I love talking Stilwell. He's fascinating.
Yeah, isn't he just? Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, good to see you as always. And chat to you next week. Cheerio, everyone.
See ya.